In this game from the FIDE Blitz World Chess Championship, we see Alexander Shimanov, a grandmaster rated 2605 in Blitz, going up against world champion Magnus Carlsen, who was rated 2830 in Blitz at the time this game was played. Shimanov begins with the move e4, and Magnus responds with e6. So the French defense, he's been playing this recently in Blitz games. He played the winner were French against Anish Giri and got a nice win. An opening that's sort of been frowned upon at the very elite level is being brought back by Magnus. d4, d5, and here knight to c3. Shimanov plays the sharpest line white has available, the critical main line. Now, knight to f6 is played by Magnus. Bishop b4, as I mentioned, was also an opening that he played in this tournament. But after knight f6, bishop to g5, he plays a rare move. He plays the move h6. More common is to just play bishop to e7 and relieve that pin, or bishop to b4, the McCutcheon variation. But he plays h6, bishop takes knight, queen takes f6. So black gets the two bishops, so Magnus has that long-term advantage, but he's lacking in space and development, and the queen on f6 is actually vulnerable to attack. First, he begins with a3, keeping the bishop out of the b4 square. Queen goes back to d8 to defend d5, which was hanging. Knight to f3 and c6. And if you look at this, after bishop to d3, Shimanov has 3 minor pieces developed and a full pawn center, and black has 0 pieces developed. And the built-in assumption is, well, white would just be better. But it's not so clear, because you have to ask yourself, what is white going to attack in black's position? And watching a few moves, how black catches up in development. The knight goes to d7, castles, bishop to e7, and now white takes on d5, which is a novelty, and e d5. So now we have a French defense exchange variation structure where you have the one open file, the one open e file. But look at this knight on c3. It's very poorly placed. Because of the pawn on c6, it has nowhere to go. It can't go anywhere. So he decides to reroute the knight to e2, the g3 square, where it's much more effective. Castles, knight to g3, aiming in the nice juicy f5 square, knight to f6. Now, here, he could play knight to e5. One of the key strategies in the French exchange variation is to advance your knight to the 5th rank and support it with your f-pawn. This works very well and probably have been a good plan for white here. But instead, he jumps in with the knight to f5, and Magnus takes that off. And in this position, notice two things. Yes, Magnus's two-bishop advantage is gone, but so is white's lead in development. Just a few moves ago, he had 3 pieces developed to none, and he had a nice full pawn center on d4 and e4. Now both are gone, and you have an equal position, and equal positions against Magnus are very, very dangerous. Bishop to d6, placing the bishop actively, c3 strengthening the center, g6 hitting the bishop, bishop d3, queen to c7. And notice how Magnus is not giving white a second chance to place a knight on e5. He's keeping that e5 square firmly under control. Rook to e1, rook to e8, queen c2, threatening potential sacrifices on g6. I don't know if it's a good sacrifice right now, but it could be, and could be soon, and black has to be ready for that. So Magnus plays the king to g7 to help cover g6. g3 blunts the queen and bishop, aiming at h2. Now h5, gaining some space, perhaps supporting a piece landing on the g4 square. King g2, queen to d7. So Magnus is threatening to bring his queen into these vulnerable light squares on white's king side. h3 keeps the queen out. Exchange of rooks, rook to e8, and now rook to e2. He would rather have black exchange and recapture with his queen staying in control of the file. Now here, in what is essentially an equal position, Magnus makes an interesting decision. He decides to change the structure of the position in order to get an advantage, or in order to outplay his opponent, to get an imbalance, really. So he plays the move c5. Now he's gained some space, but he allows, after pawn takes pawn, bishop takes pawn, he now has an isolated queen's pawn at d5, which is a target for attack. At the same time, it supports a knight's potential move to e4 and controls the key c4 and e4 square. So he gets something for it too. So he's created an imbalance to try to nudge and nibble on his opponent's position. Knight to e5 attacks the queen, queen to c7. The knight is hit twice, so now the knight retreats. Rooks come off. Queen to b6. You can begin to see Magnus sort of nibbling at his opponent's position, hitting b2, hitting f2. You can't take him yet, but it's a little bit of pressure, and it's going to add up. Knight to g5, a5. The threat is to play a4 and fix these 3 pawns on these dark squares. Since there are opposite colored bishops, he would love to fix these pawns on dark squares so that his bishop can come and eat those in an endgame. So to prevent that, white plays a4 to keep black from playing it first. Queen to c6 attacks the pawn, bishop b5 defends, queen c7. You know, I wonder what it must feel like to play Magnus in a position like this. You know his reputation. You know how good he is in these equal positions. I wonder if you just sit there sort of waiting for the shoe to drop. You know, at some point, I know he's going to get me. I know he's going to get me. That has to be inside of the head of a player when they're playing Magnus. Now here it looks like bishop to e8 is strong, right? I mean, f2 is only defended by the queen. He's threatening to take it. The reason it doesn't work very well, or I mean, it's playable, but the reason it doesn't win is this surprising move that Magnus would have played. Bishop takes f2. Now, if the queen takes f2, then the knight can just take the bishop then, because the queen doesn't defend it. But if the king takes f2, then queen to b6 check, king g2, then you take the bishop. Then after queen b2, and in this endgame, white would have 3 pawns for a knight. Excuse me, black would have 3 pawns for a knight. And this would be very tricky for white, although it's probably objectively still equal. But in this case, Shimonov, instead of playing bishop to e8, plays the bishop back to d3. And this great move by Magnus, look at this, h4. What's the idea? The idea is he wants to create a weakness for his queen to enter into white's position. So when white plays g4, white doesn't want to take. His pawns are an absolute mess in that position. The g4 queen goes to f4, attacking the knight and attacking the pawn on a4. Now, as it turns out, Magnus doesn't actually win a pawn here, although it looks like he does. But he's getting his pieces in better positions and messing up the coordination of white. So after knight f3, queen takes, he can take the pawn at h4. That's why Magnus doesn't win a pawn. Queen f4, knight to f3, and now knight to e4, taking advantage of this d5 pawn, supporting the knight, and attacking f2 with the knight and the bishop. So Shimonov chops off the knight with his bishop. Now Magnus could take with the pawn, and after knight d2, e3, actually have a pretty strong position. If he takes knight f1, then queen to e4 check, queen f3, queen c2 check, king g3, and bishop to c1, and he's going after these queenside pawns, and black is definitely much better here. But Magnus decides to take with the queen and just go right into the endgame. Queen takes queen, d takes e4, knight to g5. By the way, if you're getting value from this video, be sure to hit the subscribe button for future videos. e3 is played by Magnus, and one of the elements that happens when he accumulates these little advantages is that eventually you have to make a perfect move, and you fail to do so. And this is one of those positions. There's basically only one move white has to hold this position, and it is the study-like move, king to f1. Very hard to find. The idea is that after ef2, knight to e4, which hits the bishop and the pawn, and this is the best way for white to try and hold this position, although it's still a tough endgame. But he plays the move, pawn takes e3. And this is a mistake, as it turns out. Bishop takes, threatens the knight, and also threatens to come into c1 and attack this b2 pawn. Knight f3. Now, Magnus could go ahead and play bishop to c1 here. And after b3, b5, this pawn is marching, and he's probably just winning here too. But the move he plays is the more accurate move. He plays the move a4. The idea is he wants to fix the b pawn on b2 so it can't move up, like in the previous variation. Knight e1, bishop c1, and knight to d3. And it looks like Shimonov has saved his position. He's defending the b2 pawn, he's attacking the bishop on c1, and all is right with the world. Except for one problem. Do you see what the problem is? That's right, Magnus plays bishop takes pawn. And immediately Shimonov resigned. And the reason he resigned is this. After knight takes bishop, which he would have to play, a3. And this knight cannot stop the pawn from advancing to the queening square, and Magnus wins the game. Now, even after going over this great game from Magnus Carlsen, there's still some great chess you're missing out on. To fix that problem, believe it or not, the key game you're going to want to check out is in this video right here. So be sure to watch that next for some really mind-blowing chess. Goodbye.